For the first three chapters of Ecclesiastes, we've been dealing with some larger concepts and observations of life as it is. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile. There's a certain kind of permanence to the world, and that stability is seen in the cycles that repeat themselves. Generations go and come. The sun is rising and setting each day. The wind is turning in its cycles, and the streams are filling the oceans, yet the oceans are never full. We have ears and eyes that take things in, but also never fill up. And many times the words that can be spoken are unable to make any difference. With all the activity that we observe, it looks like things are changing. But as you look closer, there's nothing new under the sun. Fortunately, God has told us that there is a forward motion to history and that we are going ahead to a critical moment. But in the meantime, the repeating rhythms of this fallen world seem to contribute to a sense of sameness and a loss of meaning. And that futility intersects the major aspects of life. As we come to chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes, we focus a bit more on some specific situations where the vapor of life is balanced with something better. In fact, the word better will show up several times. And each part of life that is being observed is introduced by the statement, I saw. I also think that what we're going to read in chapter 4 will sound familiar to us, since it reads a lot more like the book of Proverbs, where the better things are set in contrast with those that are less advantageous. We left off at the last part of chapter 3 with the topic of injustice. Furthermore, I have seen that under the sun there is wickedness in the place of judgment, and there is wickedness in the place of righteousness. The decision makers in the courts were corrupt. They were not concerned with actual justice. As they made their judgments, they were more interested in their own advantages. When one person elevates himself or herself to a position of being a mini god, then other people are considered lesser beings, no more than animals or parts of a machine to serve the one in control. And with that mindset, humans are not seen as equally valuable. And that same kind of mentality is the backdrop behind the opening verses of chapter 4. This kind of self-exaltation leads to another kind of evil, oppression. Again, I saw all the acts of oppression being done under the sun. Look at the tears of those who are oppressed. They have no one to comfort them. Power is with those who oppress them. They have no one to comfort them. This is an issue that really seems to bother the teacher as he repeats the fact that those in this condition have no one to offer them support. This lack of comforters captures a couple of threads that will be evident throughout the chapter, and we'll get to them a little later. For now, this word is the one that is very familiar in our own time, oppression. There is a natural anger directed against someone who elevates himself over other people. There's a natural desire to find a way to correct the situation. When that person or their selected group becomes lords over other people. And yet, once again, there's nothing new under the sun. The Old Testament teaching on this subject covers the same kinds of oppression that we know so well. Oppression of the temporary resident, the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Oppression of others by a ruler, by a master over the servants. Oppression of others by the affluent over the poor, a bureaucrat over the citizen, and even by the poor over the poor. It's not unusual for the homeless to fight over one another concerning what little they have in order to be one step ahead of the next guy. And what about these forms of injustice that sound very contemporary? Crooked land developers, corrupt weights and measures, high interest rates. Our lives are really not that much different from 3,000 years ago. So maybe you feel a little bit better knowing that. There have been and will continue to be those who strong arm, harass, and otherwise show contempt to certain people who are beneath them, even though all people are made in God's image. So I admired the dead, who've already died, more than the living who are still alive. But better than either of them is the one who has not yet existed, who has not seen all the evil activity that is done under the sun. Just like we read in chapter 2, this is another expression of deep emotion, which follows with a strong declaration. In chapter 2, it was, I hate life, because the work that was done under the sun is grievous to me and everything's futile. This time, it is better off dead. Now, from a Christian worldview, we don't run with this idea very far. It contradicts what we know to be true. All human life is valuable. Yet, at moments of discouragement, when we look at the results of suffering around us, the thought does cross our minds. We do experience relief for the person who suffered in pain before death. But even before that, we've expressed, or even beyond that, we've expressed relief for someone who has died because they don't have to witness what we're seeing taking place in the culture around us, or the tragedy taking place in their own family so many years since their death. What the teacher witnesses is that oppression is a given in this world. The tears that go along with that are a given in this world. It's not right that any form of oppression should be taking place, yet as long as the human heart is what it is, oppression will be there. But the frustration captured in the opening verses centers on the fact, more specifically, that the one who's being treated unjustly is suffering alone. Again, I saw all the acts of oppression being done under the sun. Look at the tears of those who are oppressed. They have no one to comfort them. Power is with those who oppress them. They have no one to comfort them. So I admired the dead who have already died more than the living who are still alive. But better than either of these is the one who has not yet existed, who has not seen all the evil activity that is done under the sun. This is not a celebration of death, but a comparison. And it's the first of many better than sayings. In this case, the one who has not been born knows nothing of the wickedness that we might understand. The one who has not been born has not experienced the emotional, physical, or mental anguish that goes along with being considered of lesser value and treated as such. So if this is the life of the oppressed, then the one who had never been born is in a more favorable position in comparison to us. Now, you may notice that the teacher expresses great empathy in these verses, and yet he does not offer any particular course of action or say that he's going to do anything to change what he sees. And students of this passage have often asked why. If the author is Solomon, as we believe he is, if he's king, the highest executive in the land to make justice happen, why does he not do something about such oppression? One reason is that the entire book is not a New Testament epistle. In the epistles, we are given direct commands on how to face wickedness or to deal with our old nature as we strive to be more like Christ. Instead, Ecclesiastes is a collection of life observations and life experiences. It is an earthy and realistic record of the human journey. Another reason has to do with the pervasiveness of sin. It's easy to believe that one person is going to overturn oppression and bring peace to the land, or at least some segment of the land. Listen to those who almost worship a political candidate leading up to an election. It's like a savior figure. And yet, how many leaders throughout history, even the best of the best, have been able to remove injustice from the land for more than a short time? How many of you are parents? Biblically, you are in charge of your home. And yet, have you stamped out all oppression in that little kingdom? Have you been able to eliminate all the teasing and bullying between siblings and cousins and friends when they visit? Have you never dismissed another member of your own household as less worthy of your time or focus because you determined that some other thing was more valuable at the moment? Solomon may have been the wisest king to ever live, but He also had 12 district governors over Israel who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. They were literally tax collectors. Anyone who manages a staff knows that even the most qualified leader is unable to change every human heart or prevent those hearts from becoming more prideful. In Ecclesiastes, the teacher does not offer any grand solutions to the problems of the earth, but he does offer an implicit and explicit challenge. This is life as it is. You will be puzzled by the disconnect and the inconsistencies between what you know should be and what actually is. But don't try to figure it all out. Trust God. Let Him be your source of meaning and value. From observations on the topic of oppression, we come back again to the subject of work. Now, we've dealt with this several times already, but this time we look at some of the motivations behind our efforts. Here is one: envy. I saw that all labor and all skillful work is due to a man's jealousy of his friend. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Remember, we're reading wisdom literature. It's made up of word pictures and parts of speech to invite us to engage with the text. And yet, one literary device that appears in wisdom literature, along with the rest of the Bible, sometimes gets overlooked. It is the hyperbole, a figure of speech which expresses much more or less than the truth, or which represents things much greater or less, better or worse, than they really are. The jealousy of someone else in business is not always the motivation to excel in business, but it is often the case. So we have a hyperbole. In verse 4, we're looking at the envy of another person who is or may become successful. Envy can be both the motivation for success and the result of success. It is the suspicion or realization that others are gaining more from life than we are that leads us to compete with them in an insane rat race, striving to outdo them. Regardless of where it comes from, it is a direct violation of the 10th commandment. Since the terms are so closely related, we often speak of jealousy or envy interchangeably. But whatever term is used, they are repeatedly identified in scriptures as primarily sinful. There are only two exceptions where they are not. One place where jealousy is proper is in the divine-human relationship. God is jealous of his relationship with us and will not condone the worship of any other God. For our part, we need to jealously guard our relationship with him so that no other influences or associations put him in second place in our hearts. The other context is the marriage relationship. The exclusivity of marriage requires both the husband and wife to deliberately guard their relationship. It must be a priority above all other human connections. But the one with God and the one between marriage partners is a jealousy that does not seek harm or revenge. It is seeking to protect what is good. Here in chapter 4, the jealousy is an example of the sinful kind, which we're more familiar with, keeping up with the Joneses. I saw that all labor and all skillful work is due to a man's jealousy of his friend. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. My desire to be in a better position than the guy next door drives me to work long days in order to surpass him, to gain bragging rights. It's another type of vapor. Even if I achieve the lead position over him, how long will it last? And at what cost? In contrast to that picture of work, we find another picture of work in verse 5. The fool folds his arms and consumes his own flesh. The folding of the arms is an Old Testament image of not working. Some see it as a positive and opposite reaction to the insanity of verse 4. But does the one who walked away from the rat race actually show greater wisdom? In some ways, perhaps. However, he is clearly identified here as a fool, not as wise. And that's because this is not a description of rest, which, by the way, is a good and wise thing. Verse 5 describes the other end of the work spectrum, slothfulness. This is the leech that somehow believes he doesn't need to earn his keep. It's the man or woman wasting away, committed to a life of doing nothing productive. And if the lazy person refuses to work, what food is left for him to obtain so that he does not starve? Well, in answer to that, we're given a disturbing image of self-cannibalism. He consumes his own flesh. One type of call that law enforcement officers are asked to respond to is known as a welfare check. I thought it was something you got in the mail, but that's not what it is. It's a call that comes in from a concerned relative or friend who asks the police to look in on a person that cannot be reached. Now, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's not completely surprising that in some of those calls, the police arrive at the home only to find that person already dead, a shell of what used to be there. I saw that all labor and all skillful work is due to man's jealousy of his friend. This too is futile in a pursuit of the wind. The fool folds his arms and consumes his own flesh. Each picture is a perversion of what work was supposed to be. The first one is the snapshot of what our society considers business success. Endless work to get ahead of someone else and put the company on top, regardless of what it cost you to get there. And yet in that pursuit, there is rarely a moment to enjoy the fruits of the labor. The second one is a picture of endless summer, Christmas every day. All vacation, no work, sleeping late, doing nothing. Not for a season, which is a good thing, but for the remainder of time. As a counterbalance to both of those extremes, we're given another better than comparison in verse 6. Better one handful with rest than two handfuls with toil and a pursuit of the wind. As an answer to the first worker motivated by envy, and the second non-worker motivated by leisure, we have this. And as I began reading verse 6, I found it particularly relevant to our time this many centuries later. It describes what has become a larger focal point in our culture for those who are earning a living. We call it a work-life balance. Those entering the workforce or switching jobs easily talk about this factor when deciding on their next position. Our Ecclesiastes study has provided you a Bible verse to support that conversation. If a career opportunity requires you to travel 3 to 4 weeks out of the month, but the person has priorities at home and at church and in his neighborhood, then a huge salary is not that attractive after all. A lower salary is actually considered more valuable if it allows the person to have a healthy work-life balance between the time spent earning and the time spent with family or other personal endeavors. Better one handful with rest than two handfuls with toil in a pursuit of the wind. One handful is enough, two is too much. In a work situation, it's the difference between putting in a solid work effort versus obsessing about something that will not fundamentally improve by more hours, no matter how much you invest. It's an issue of ultimately being content with the fruit of your labor as you obtain it and taking time to appreciate it. Again, these are concepts we've seen before in the same book. In verse 7, there's another work situation that the teacher has also witnessed. Again, I saw futility under the sun. There's a person without a companion, even without a son or a brother, and though there's no end to all his labor, his eyes are still not content with his riches. So who am I toiling for, he asks, and depriving myself from enjoyment? This too is futile and a miserable task. Here we have a different work ethic from the motivation of jealousy. This one is more focused on obtaining stuff and accumulating all the things that larger incomes might offer. Greed. And this compulsion to work and achieve is captured in the eyes. His eyes are never satisfied with riches. Now, we're familiar with the word picture because it started in Genesis 3 with Eve. And it's a phrase that captures the Hebrew understanding that the eye is the source of our desire. We might say his heart is never satisfied, which communicates the same thing. So this solitary person is working without a spouse, without any children, no heirs, no relatives. In a typical situation, those are the people who would contribute to the building of the business and share in the profits of the business. This guy may work as much as the envious worker, but he never completes his quest to obtain more. He's not content with what he's acquired already either. It's a very sad picture, because for all this man's effort, he has no one else that he cares about who is able to enjoy what he has learned along with him. Now, how he got to this position, we're not told. Did he have this obsession to gain things by working endless hours, and that drove away his spouse and his kids and his relatives and his friends? Or was he one of those who was left alone as an orphan early in life, so he is determined that he doesn't need anybody, and he would find meaning in business instead? Regardless of how he got there, he becomes one of the oldest images of the character we know so well. Since he wants these riches for himself, he withdraws himself from others, so that he may not in any way be obliged to share with others what he acquires. A typical miser. He's not content with the wealth that he obtains, and he's not building wealth with the desire to share it with anybody else. He's a workaholic who doesn't have time to stop and answer the question of true value. So who am I toiling for and depriving myself from enjoyment? This is futile and a miserable task. The question is like the challenge from verse 6, where the work-life balance by which to stop and enjoy the profits you already have. Where is that? Well, a person might wake up from this entire approach to life, and that's what we pray for if somebody's in this situation. We have no idea how many never make it there before they are not here, working themselves to death with no reward. In contrast to this sad story, we continue with several examples of something better. And this next part ends with a well-known proverb. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their efforts. For if either falls, his companion can lift him up, but pity the one who falls without another to lift him up. Also, if two lie down, they can keep warm, but how can one person alone keep warm? And if someone overpowers one person, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. Now, for as bumpy as it's been to read through the book of Ecclesiastes, the further we study, the more I'm finding ways to navigate the potholes. So you're not alone in your journey. While the topics change quickly and we are left with more questions than answers in a lot of cases, I'm coming to appreciate certain threads that keep this book together. The better part of chapter 4 has to do with work and wealth, and what we do to others and to ourselves in order to achieve certain advantages. So the question that covers the entire book really does fit in here as well. What does a man gain for all that he labors at under the sun? Pride and arrogance leads one person to elevate himself above someone else. So oppression is rooted in the idea that by putting someone below me, I obtain greater control. That's the advantage. In the second example, the motive that drives another person to work and outshine his business competitor is envy. Whether in civic life or financial, economic life, the expectation is that any of these actions will result in some gain. The entire corporate ladder imagery and value system is reflected in this part of Ecclesiastes. And in the part that we just read, we have a third image, a miser, working endless days for no other person but himself, all in the hopes of greater profit and material advantage. And yet we know, both from reading this book and from our own life experiences, that the gains are just a vapor. They're acts of futility. And more often than not, those attempts at getting something more creates so much collateral damage that they fail to be actual benefits when they arrive. So we're offered a different answer to this ongoing question about where value is found. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their efforts. Now, in the immediate context, this would include the earnings from a partnership, actual financial gain. Your own wages may not actually be as much as if you worked by yourself, but the work is easier and the stress level is lower with a helper. More can get done in the same amount of hours when you have another person working towards the same goal. But beyond the business setting and financial setting, the toil or effort is part of any endeavor that you take on. Those of you who have tried to do a task that really requires 4 hands instead of 2 know exactly how this applies. And the fellowship application is an obvious one that we bring into the New Testament, sharing life together. Partnering in ministry is another one. When you have a partner in ministry, it is so much more fulfilling and enjoyable and profitable than trying to do ministry alone. Plus, as we read further, the advantages also become very practical, better in time of need. If either falls, his companion can lift him up, but pity the one who falls without another to lift him up. We have commercials about this now, and little things around your neck to help you get up when you need help. But to appreciate this particular benefit, some understanding of the landscape of ancient Israel is probably important. When it comes to traveling beyond the roads and safety of any given city, actually losing your footing was a real issue. Beyond the city limits, the geography was dry, rocky, and wide open. While there may have been rest stops along the way, there were large spans of empty wilderness between such places. Without paved roads, there's a variety of hills and valleys and narrow passages, so that traveling was dangerous and difficult. The Good Samaritan story is evidence of that. And yet having someone to lift you up out of a hole would include also financial difficulties. Again, the context is work. From there, it's easy to apply this to include an endless number of ways that somebody might stumble, so that a companion is your means of rescue from those scenarios. The remaining verses demonstrate additional benefits of working with others, better comfort in time of need. Also, if 2 lie down together, they can keep warm, but how can one person alone keep warm? Now, our Western perspective can make this particular description a little less appealing. We even call it sleeping together to mean something else. But in the Eastern mind, that's not the first place where their minds would go. It's much more basic. 2 people together naturally provide beneficial warmth in the cold without any thought of something improper going on. And even today, survival guidelines recommend sharing body temperatures by holding on to one another if you're in an extreme cold situation and have to wait for rescue. Here's another advantage: protection from danger. And if someone overpowers one person, 2 can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. You know, it's the person that walks alone in every single movie or story or real life down the dark alley that it's most in danger compared to a group of friends walking together. And so the final and often quoted phrase is the high point of this section. If 2 are better than 1, then 3 is even more beneficial than that. This section highlights for us a couple of threads that run through the entire chapter. But before we appreciate that focus, let's look at the next part, which wraps it up. There is something else that's better. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he came from prison to be king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who move about under the sun follow the youth who succeeds him. There's no limit to all the people who were before them, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. We have an illustration of 2 primary characters: an old but foolish king and a young poor man who had come from prison. And from this we have a contrast of 3 pieces. We have the young versus the old, the poor man versus the wealthy king, and the wise versus the fool. Now, like the Old Testament saints who would have first heard this, we have the same assumption that the older king would naturally be wiser than the young man because he's had more years to gain that. But that's not the case because of an attitude that the king displays. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. There are so many tyrants that litter the graves of history who have embraced this approach to life. And there's several that are alive right now doing the same thing. The king once listened to the advice of others and the wisdom that would come his way, but he no longer does so. He's not open to the advice of anyone else. And as a result, the advisor that instructs the king about something the king does not want to know or believe is the advisor that gets replaced by the morning, or worse. When it comes to warning leaders, the book of Proverbs has several similar statements confirming the wisdom we find here. To succeed, those kings must be open to the advice of the advisors when making critical decisions, particularly when deciding on war. So a demonstration of wisdom is the ability to listen, and listen well. Those who keep talking don't pause long enough to understand what's happening within the conversation, since they're so much more focused on what they want to say. And yet it's through listening that each person obtains greater insight into what is taking place outside their own heads. For he came from a prison to be king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw the living who move about under the sun follow the youth who succeeds him. Now, depending on your English translation, this may be describing two people or three. We have the older king and the younger former prisoner. If there's a second man who comes after the young king, then the flow of the story remains the same either way. The young but wise youth came from a poor and humble background and replaces the foolish old man. This new leader was the underdog that had a great turnaround of fortune. And so he reached a high point in his rule where he enjoyed the popularity of the entire nation. I saw all the living who move about under the sun follow the youth who succeeds the older king. There's no limit to all the people who are before them. Now, you might think that the wise leader who is in place would now have citizens that would continue to appreciate him. But as time moved forward, those who grow up after the young king had been in place did not value him the same way as those who watched him rise to power. And so the new generation got tired of him. One scholar suggested that the last verse about there being no end to all the people may not be about being popular, like verse 15 says. Instead, there is no limit to all the people who were before him might be a reference to the endless burden of royal office. The work of governing never stops because there's always another citizen that needs the king's attention. So if it's an issue of popularity that doesn't end or loses, or the burden of oversight because of the position, or both for that matter, here's the point. Even with a wise leader at the top of the government chain, there is no guarantee that the people will want to follow. This too is meaningless and a chasing after the wind. All political power will not last, even when it is merged with wisdom. So it has become clear that one key theme that ties chapter 4 together is identifying what's better. For each of the issues the teacher has witnessed, he does not offer any grand solutions. That frustrates us because we're looking for details. But he does offer observations of those things that are just vapor compared to what is better. What is better is the answer to what do I gain? What benefit is in this? What is better is the alternative to futility, chasing after the wind. And in discovering the specifics of what is better, we find a couple of threads that run through this entire chapter. The first is isolation. The oppressed were alone because they had no one to look out for them, so they suffered under others who lorded over them in order to take advantage of them. We have the isolation in the other two. The envious worker cuts himself away from others in his attempt to control and protect whatever advantage he may have over the other guy. The fool who will not work similarly cuts himself off from others to the point that he dies alone, his body feeding on itself. The greedy miser works for his own benefit, separated from family, friends, relatives, and heirs who might enjoy the blessings he's obtained along with him. And yet the king actually had become isolated in a different way. He became wise in his own eyes and no longer needed the advice of anyone else. As a result, he lost the advantage of true wisdom. So the threat of isolation is now countered by another threat, which is a better option: companionship. Companionship is a gain which removes the isolation. It prevents the wise leader from becoming a fool. It shares the burden that an isolated person must otherwise face alone. It gives purpose to our work, since we are vesting ourselves not only in the work, but in others who benefit from it through those efforts. It limits jealousy as we look out for the success of our friends instead of wanting what they have instead. It prevents us from forcing our will on someone else and drives us to come to the person's aid when they're facing an injustice. And companionship is a restoration, ultimately, of the life that God created for us to enjoy: life in community with God, with one another, and in harmony with creation. Our work, whether that's paid or volunteer in any setting, was given to us for both our own satisfaction, doing something meaningful, and for the benefit of other people. Work is good. It's a gift from God. And yet it's often mangled by the kinds of motivations that we've read about today. And so when we work for any other reasons that ultimately bring us isolation, we're actually violating a God-given purpose for work. And we're violating the health of our relationships in any or all of these areas that we looked at. So let's see if we can summarize what chapter 4 offers us concerning our work ethic and how it improves or impacts our relationships. First, work, but don't let it consume you. Don't let it be out of envy, greed, or the need to lord over others. Rest, but don't embrace laziness. It destroys you. If you reach the top, thank God. In due time, you will lose favor and be replaced by somebody else. Balance your rest with work. Be content with and enjoy the fruit of your labor with others. And more than anything else, our work, our service, our ministry, whatever term you want to throw into that, is meant to be in cooperation with others who value Christ as we do. So develop friendships. They guard us against many forms of danger. They offer us rewards as we work in partnership towards the same goals. They provide strength in our lives, protecting us many times from ourselves. Heavenly Father, we appreciate some of the things that are found in this one chapter. And we thank you for another opportunity to gather together to look at your word and study it. Please allow some of these things to remain with us as we go back to a normal routine this afternoon or tomorrow morning or after the holiday weekend is over, seeking to put in effort, babysitting, looking out for loved ones, watching after a sick relative, physically going to work, producing something of value. We ask that you'd give us the ability to appreciate some of those moments, and when we get home and sit down for a moment and enjoy a meal, to enjoy the fact that we have that meal in front of us. So, Father, the simple things in life are often said to be some of the most valuable, and you've put it together that way. Let us as your people be able to appreciate those things as they come, particularly as we come into this season where the holidays, including Thanksgiving, are part of the mix. Father, you're an amazing God, providing us beyond what we really need for many things that we really want. Thank you. Give us the grace to be the best reflections of your Son that we can be until we meet again next week. Amen.
Please stand.